I really, I'm very happy to put it on Zoom, but I'm also like not really entirely sure there's a point to it. Say it again. I'm sorry, Nigam, did you say something?
No, I think Jan did.
I just saw you, I wanted to.
Yeah. All right. So the priestly blessing, probably, as I said, so we're in Parashat Naso, the second Torah portion of the book of Numbers. So last week we started the book of Numbers, and it's called Numbers in English because we take our names of the Bible from the Greek translation, and that one begins with the idea of numbers, right? It's very much about counting up all of the Israelites in the desert, right? Making a census. And how many Israelites were there? Are we told? 600, I think 4,000, maybe some 600,000 and change, shall we say, right? And that's just the men.
Just the men.
Just the men.
I was going to say, they count the men.
So the women and the children, presumably, so we're talking a city. How many people live in Boston? Does anyone know?
More.
660,000 people.
Oh, that includes women and children.
Including the women and children, right? Our censuses don't limit themselves just to the men, right? And why would they limit themselves to the men?
The fight.
Right, because it's all about the fighting. It's all about the tzava, right? It's all about the army. And this was not, it was in the pre-Enlightenment times when the women didn't serve in the army. So now, of course, the Hebrew name of the book of Numbers is not Numbers. Does anyone know what it is? It's Bamidbar. Bamidbar is in the wilderness, in the desert, right? In the wilderness. And it's and what are you doing, Rosie? She's itchy just in general. Oh, guys, you can really, actually, Faye, at this point, you can let them go. Well, if they bother people, then let me know.
Wait, you should close the door.
Yeah. No, Faye, if they won't let you alone, then we're gonna have to do something different.
No, I don't think so.
No, not this side, this side. All right, and it's actually a really, I think, a much better name for the book, right? It makes more sense because the book is not only about counting, right? There's a fair amount of counting in the book, but that's not the only thing it's about, right? And Bamidbar really gets to the essence of the book, right? That it's really about wandering in the wilderness, right? Being kind of betwixt and between, not being where you were, right? But also not being where you're going to, right? Which is, in a sense, that's kind of our lives, right? We're always kind of moving from one thing to the next.
We're on our journey.
On our journey, right? Sometimes it feels on our journeys like what we're going in circles, right? And that's essentially, in a sense, what the Israelites do a fair amount of. All right. And also just sort of interesting to notice, and scholars have done analyses of these things, that it's very interesting to look at the sort of the overall arc of the story of the Exodus, right, in the book of Exodus, right, which, unlike Numbers, right, has a better name in Greek and English than it does in Hebrew, right? The book of Exodus in Hebrew is Shemot, right? These are the names. It doesn't really capture, right, the essence of the book the way Exodus captures it, right? But Exodus is really about the renewal of the connection between the Israelites and God, right? And the actual exodus from Egypt, right? Then the giving of the Torah, right? And the building of the tabernacle, right? Which is the way that the Israelites can sort of feel most fully the presence of God, right? The Midbar, in a sense, kind of reverses the process, right? There's a lot of scary stuff that happens in Bamidbar. Right? There's a lot of episodes that are not so nice. But we're going to talk today about one of the nice things in the Book of Numbers, right? Which is the priestly blessing. So that's what this is here. Now, the priestly blessing is something that actually he doesn't bring. This one doesn't bring enough of the priestly blessing. So I'm not going to go find a different one, but I will remind myself of it and read it to you. Priestly blessing happens in the context, right, that the priests in our tradition, right, what's the job of the priest in our tradition?
Less people?
Well, that's one of the things, right? But what would be the point of blessing someone?
You mean the Levites?
Well, the Levites are part of the part of the
Cohen.
yeah, part of the Kohanim, but they're not actually Kohanim, right?
Does he sacrifice?
Sacrifice. And why do we sacrifice?
Yeah, why?
Why do we sacrifice?
Sometimes God.
Great question.
God, it's make atonement.
Say again?
Make atonement.
Right. So that's one of the reasons we would make sacrifice, right? And the book of Leviticus talks a lot, right, about what do we do when we've made a sin of some variety, right? What do we do when we've made a mistake and we need to atone, right? We make an offering, right? But we don't make an offering only when we sin. How often do we make an offering? Every day, right? Every day we make an offering to God.
You know, I understand sometimes we have to sacrifice when we get to eat the animal.
Yeah.
But sometimes it just burns up. And
Yeah.
Why does God? I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, again, like it's a very complicated atavistic kind of concept, right? That for us, if we have the kind of relationship that we often have with animals today, right, it's very hard to understand how could they have a different kind of relationship with animals back in those days. They just did. It was just a very much less there was just a different way of interacting with animals then.
I just think we don't see the animals that we eat. I mean, that's.
Well, that's part of it.
Yeah,
There's a lot.
Isn't it like feeding God, right?
In a sense, right? That's the sort of metaphor, right? Yeah.
Oh, wasn't it an improvement over sacrificing people?
Right, exactly, right. It's much better to sacrifice animals than to sacrifice people, right? Much better, the rabbis would say, to pray in the synagogue than to sacrifice animals, right? The religions change over time, right? But they have a trick, right? Religions have a trick where they have to change constantly, right? But they can never appear to change, right? So, for instance, like, people sometimes will come to me. I mean, here I generally do kind of the same tunes pretty much every week, right? But every once in a while, someone comes in who's new and says, "Rabbi, I've never heard any of the songs that you sing for Shabbat." I'm like, every synagogue in Boston sings certain songs for Shabbat, right? So I know that that's not true, but right, as soon as they've been around for a couple of weeks, those are the tunes, right? And if you change them again, you change the tune, right? It's not allowed to change, right? So it has to change constantly because the world changes and people change, and it can't change at all, right? And Judaism is especially that way, right? We never like to give anything up, right? We always want to keep everything. So, yes, we no longer sacrifice animals, right? But we are going to read in the Torah about how we sacrifice animals. But we've not actually answered the question that I had, right? Which is, why do we do it? One answer was atonement. One answer was feeding God, right? Which the Torah has to deal with the fact, right, that used to be the way people thought about sacrifice. So they need to come up with another thing. So they come up with this idea, reach nichoach, right, a pleasing odor. Right? God's not going to eat it, but God somehow has olfactory senses that God will enjoy, right? But the answer, I think, right, is that it is what allows people to feel the presence of God, right? That by doing these rituals, right, we invite God into our lives, into our midst, right, into our communities, right? And if we do certain rituals, right, and every culture has rituals, right? There's an article today in one of the newspapers that comes over the internet about a Jewish studies professor who has studied Disney adults and who considers their use of Disney, their engagement with Disney, the characters, the parks, the movies, the this and the that, as a kind of quasi-religion, right? That they have attached rituals, right, and meaning to their use of Disney stuff, right? So, okay, whatevs, it's up to them, obviously. All right, so the job of the priest then, as the one who's making the offerings, right, the priest's job is to make sure that God's presence in the community is maintained at all times, right? And so it's a very important job, right? And so just to sort of give away the punchline of Judaism in general, right, is that the rabbis come along after the destruction of the temple and they say there's no more job for the Kohanim, right? There's very few responsibilities for a Kohen today, right? The only thing that really remains for the Kohen is to be the first person to come up for an aliyah in the synagogue, right? And some synagogues still do that, other synagogues do not. And then the other job is for the Kohanim to bless the congregation with the priestly blessing on holidays, right? And in Israel, they do it on Shabbat as well. And then there's a third thing called Pidyon Haben, which is, we don't have to get into that. All right.
I thought it was the Levites who did the sacrificing.
No, the Levites are sort of the they're sort of the janitors or the right. Yeah. The janitors is the wrong word, but they're sort of helpers of the Kohanim. The servants of the Kohanim. Yeah. So they're doing service as well, right? Some of them do porterage. The previous parsha, last week's parsha, goes into great detail about what the various clans of the Levites do. Some of them are to pick stuff up and carry it around. Others are to pack up the portable tabernacle, so on and so forth. Today, what the Levites do is they're supposed to wash the feet, I think, of the Kohanim when it's time for them to say the priestly blessing at the on Shabbat and holidays.
Quickly, if the Levites have no property, they don't own anything.
Right.
Where do they sleep?
It's a good question. I should know the answer. I went to rabbinical school. I should know the answer to that. I just don't off the top of my head. I apologize.
They rent it.
That's right. They have rentals, right? They have dormitories. And all right. So this is what it says in the Torah. We'll get to the Yevarechecha part in a second. So the Lord spoke to Moses, right? Speak to Aaron and his sons, thus shall you bless the people of Israel and say to them, right? Ko tivarachu et bnei Israel amor lahem. Right? So the job of the priests here, right, is to bless the people. Right? And what is the blessing that they give them? Right? And I'm just going to sort of put aside for the fact that it's not entirely clear, of course, what it means to bless someone, right? We bless God. We say Baruch Atah Adonai, right? We say, blessed are you, God, right? We ask for a blessing, right? You can say a blessing is to say hello, right? So there's all different kinds of ways of understanding. We're just going to sort of bracket that question, and we're going to focus on other things. But we're just going to kind of assume we know more or less what we're saying when we're. So what is the substance of this blessing? Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, right? Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka, and Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom, right? V'sam'u et shemi al b'nei Yisrael va'ani avarechem. All right, so I didn't translate any of that. So let's start, I guess, with a little bit of translation, and then we can talk about it a little bit. What do we think it means? All right, so Yivarechecha means, may God bless you. Yivarechecha Adonai. May God bless you. May Adonai bless you. Or Yud He Vav He, if you want to put it that way. Right? And what else is God going to do? The Yish Morecha, right? And guard you or protect you. All right. The second thing is Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. So this is translated here as the Lord deal kindly and graciously with you. Right, so Vaya'er is probably more like shine his face. Right, Panav is his face. Ya'er maybe shine, right? Or the Aleph Resh usually has something to do with light, right? So have light up, may God's face light up upon you, right? And may he be gracious. Will he grant you grace, right? Give you grace. So we can talk about what all this stuff means. What does it mean to be protected? What does it mean to be given grace? What does it mean to have God's face shine on you? Right? And then finally, Yisa Adonai panav elecha, v'yasem lecha shalom. Right? May God lift up God's face to you and place on you, by Yasem, right? Put on you peace, shalom. So raises another question. Is there any difference between shining God's face and lifting up God's face? Are they different things, or are they just synonyms for the same thing? Right? And what does it mean to have shalom? Right? Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, this is what constitutes sort of the highest blessing in Judaism. Right, I mean, these three, right? These three. So a question to sort of ask ourselves, I think, is, are there other blessings that we might, hi Penny, are there other blessings that we might expect to see here? That there should be, are there other things we should be praying for? Other things we should be asking for from God? Or that
Be provided.
Okay, right. So to be provided for is one, right? What else might we think of that other maybe cultures might pray for from God?
Health.
For health, okay. You might be able to put that one under the rubric of protection, right? It was sort of a subset, right, of protection.
For food.
For food, sustenance, right? Yeah. Anything else that you can think of? Happiness, there we go. What?
Love.
Love, okay.
I'd like to know what it means, grace. In Judaism, is grace where you don't deserve it, but you get God's blessing?
Well, I've always thought of grace in that sense as being, this might be just because I'm because I converted from Christianity, so I always think of that as sort of a Christian understanding of grace.
It is, yeah.
But I don't think that's so far off. But we'll talk about that. Like we'll talk about that.
The difference between grace and mercy. God having grace and mercy.
Right. Okay. So rachamim isn't here, right? Mercy, compassion, right? We're not asking specifically for. Now, obviously, you can't ask for everything. And one of the things about this, right, is that we've got this beautiful poetic structure. It's kind of like a Hebrew haiku, right? There's 3 words, then 5 words, then 7 words, right? There's this, this sort of particular kind of pyramidal kind of a structure to it, right? There's this constant repetition of God's name, right? Which is alluded to in the line right after it, right? V'samu et shemi, and you will place my name on the children of Israel. It's not enough, right? Just to say, God bless, right? You have to use God's name. Go ahead, Naomi.
Doesn't the blessing itself convey, if God is being gracious unto you, if God is letting his face shine upon you, that all of the other things that have been mentioned are somehow incorporated?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I also think it's interesting to think about why specifically these 3 blessings, the things at the end of the words at the end of each line, why these particular ones, right? And maybe part of that, Naomi, would be like, how do we fit all the other blessings that we might think about? Where would we put them? Does this sort of does this really actually account for everything? Right. I'll give away what Jonathan Sachs says. Right. He says, we're not looking. Jews are never looking for world domination. Right. We're not President Putin here. Right? Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. Right. There's never been, never will be a Jewish empire. Right. It's not part of the Jewish game. Right.
Well, I mean,
like
it's interesting that Judaism is the only, I don't know, but it doesn't missionize.
Right.
It missionizes other Jews.
But it did for a long time.
Yeah.
Did it?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that actually has more to do, I would say, with anti-Semitism. The fact that we don't proselytize has to do with how dangerous it was to proselytize in the context of the fact that Jews lived among Christians and among Muslims. In both of those religions, basically considered it a crime if someone converted from them to Judaism. So that accounts for a lot of the reason why rabbis developed the process of pushing people away from becoming Jewish, because they didn't want to get in trouble, right? But in the time of the Talmud, converting to Judaism was not any much more complicated than converting to Islam is today, right? Today you say the Shahada and you're a Muslim, right? It used to be you say the Shema and you're Jewish. Great, go learn, right?
It's not like that.
It's not like that anymore, right? For a whole lot of reasons. And I actually think on the whole, it's not a bad thing, right? That it's not a snap thing. People can't make a snap decision. And I think that is actually the point you're trying to make, I think, Rachel, is really that it's not that we don't go out and sort of let people know how great it is to be Jewish, right? It's more that we don't want people to become Jewish unless they really want to become Jewish, right? Judaism is not a universal religion. And I think that's connected to the whole idea of we're not praying for military conquest.
But we're not the dominating goal, but back then, weren't we, when we had kings and queens and the law was with the Shahidrin, wasn't, we used to rule the law?
I don't know, Faye. I'm very doubtful about that.
We're still a minority back then.
And there are lots and lots of tiny little kingdoms all over the place. So yeah. All right, but and then so for the final two words here, right? Just the importance that you're going to put, the priests have to put my name, right? My name, Yod He Vav He. You're going to put it onto the people, right? And I will bless them. Va'ani avarachem. Right, I will bless them. That's
How do you put your Levi out?
Very interesting question. How do you do it? So has anyone?
Put your Levi out.
So did anyone grow up with parents who did the priestly blessing over the kids on the Shabbat table?
No.
Yeah. So that is actually one. So one of the things you do is you put your hand on the head of the person you're blessing, and that is, I think, in a certain way, that is sort of a symbolic, right, of placing the name. I was just visiting someone in the hospital yesterday who's very ill, and when I left, I gave them the priestly blessing, and I put my hand on their head, right, and recited the blessing. And that's just kind of that's the custom. And I don't know if it's really connected or if I'm just making it up.
You know what's nice? How to put God's name on us is you name your child with one of the virtues or attributes of God, like kind or patience, or if you can find a name.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like Adele, is that Hebrew or Yiddish that means kind?
I don't know. Does anyone know what Adele means?
Do you know what Adele means?
Well, Adele is Adel, which is a Germanic root.
And what does it mean?
It means noble.
Oh, well, Noble is good too.
It's my middle name.
Yeah, Noble.
No, Adele.
Oh, Adele is your middle name. Okay. It might mean something in Hebrew. I'm not familiar with it. All right. So, So I think just sort of thinking again about what do you think we mean? What do you think when we're asking for God's protection? What are we talking about?
Protection from Corona.
Wow.
No.
I love it.
People feel very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah, still, I mean, even though we're less vulnerable, but at that time.
Yeah. I mean, Hello, you going to join us?
I think I'm just soft and say hello.
Thank you. It's nice to see you. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here.
What do we ask for protection?
Right. So I think you're absolutely right. Right. I don't think, and although right, we have vaccines against COVID, right, and we have sanitation, we have clean water, we have all this sort of stuff, right? I think that still, right, there's a sort of being alive, right, being in the world involves sort of a level of insecurity, right, of uncertainty, of feeling vulnerable.
Fragile.
Go ahead, Faye.
Sometimes I feel vulnerable, and I have a lot of Christian friends that goes way back to when I was little, that they really don't like me, not because of who you are, but their religion. And it's always in my mind, and I'm very careful sometimes how I speak, because I don't want to insult anybody. But that remains with you when you grow up.
Can you say that, Jeff?
Yeah, so Faye is saying, and Faye, tell me if I say it incorrectly, that she grew up with a lot of non-Jews, a lot of Christians, and many of the Christians didn't like Jews, not because you were not a nice person, but because just straight anti-Semitism, right? And I think and that stays with you, and I think that's exactly right. I think that anyone who experiences some level of oppression or discrimination as they're growing up, right? You never fully lose it.
No,
Right.
you, because I grew up on lectures too. You don't forget it.
Right.
People think you Jewish, so what's the big deal? But people doesn't like it.
No, so I think that it's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, Faye, but I think it's really an important
That's
piece, right? That historically, now I'm not going to speak about when the Torah was written, right? But for the last 2 millennia, to be sure, right? Being Jewish since the rise of the Roman Empire has been really tough, right? And so praying for protection against the people that hate us makes a lot of sense.
it's all over the Torah, it's all over
I can understand the idea of protection, and I think that's included. But somehow I feel it's much more fundamental, because when God puts his name on a being, he recognizes that being as a person, or whatever he recognizes.
Yes. Yeah. So it sort of, I mean, I don't know if I'm understanding you entirely, but sort of like there's a sort of a validation of a person's existence,
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yes.
And that is sort of the sort of foundational.
It's an essence.
It's right. It's a foundational sort of. That's the foundation on which the idea of protection and grace and everything is. Right. So So that's interesting, right? That's not part of the blessing formula, right? It's the sort of the mechanics of it after the fact, right? That you're putting my name on that, right? And it sort of speaks, right, to an interesting thing that's related to the question you asked, right? The thing that you were saying, Faye, right? Which is that there's something about Bnei Israel, right? There's something about the Jews that makes them different than everybody else, right? And we talk in the Bible about how God sort of claims the Jews as their own, right? And people get very sore about that, right? Which is another reason sometimes people have a sort of a simplistic understanding of that, and they decide they're not going to like the Jews because they have a very simple binary sort of understanding of that idea. Yeah.
It's all over the Psalm, protect us from enemies, from hate, from enemies.
Oh yeah.
It's all over the Torah.
Oh, of course, the protection is right, and it's in the evening service, right? We have a whole thing about protect us from the terrors of the nighttime, right? The night is a time that's a dangerous time.
And noon.
We don't pray for protection in the morning. We pray for protection at night, which is very interesting. Yeah. Go ahead, Faye.
I think when I was growing up, which is a long time ago, the churches were teaching that the Jews could regard Jesus Christ.
Right.
And I never knew who he was.
Right.
I was a little girl walking with two Christian friends. And then we went by to Catholic Church and they said you have to bow down and tell God you're sorry.
Oh, whiz.
I didn't hear it.
She said that her friends, when they walked by the church, said that they had to kneel down and apologize for killing Jesus.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Did you? Good for you.
I didn't. I said, I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, it's
It doesn't make no sense.
no,
You
it
really don't.
right.
I asked my mother when we went home, who is Jesus Christ? She said, actually, he was a rabbi.
Yeah.
And a great teacher.
Right.
And some people believe he's not the son of God.
Right.
But he was disciple.
Right.
And
Yes.
So then I knew what I can say.
Right.
Isn't some of that in the New Testament?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Some of it's definitely in the New Testament. And this is the thing to remember about that, right, is that Judaism and Christianity, or the kind of Judaism that we tend to think about today, right, rabbinic Judaism, not biblical Judaism, but rabbinical Judaism, right, and Christianity were really sisters. They were really sibling religions coming up at the same time. And just like there's Cain and Abel, right, there's Christianity and Judaism. There's a lot of rivalry between them, right? And so the Talmud has a lot of not so nice things to say about Christians, including even passages where they reflect on the idea that, well, maybe the Jews did kill Jesus. And Lenny Bruce talks about that as well, by the way. So, latter day Talmudist, and of course, but those passages are not that famous, right? Obviously, the Gospels are very, very well known, right? And so the kind of sibling rivalry nastiness of blaming the Jews for the death of Jesus, right, has really persisted. Right, even though the Catholic Church has officially denied that, right? They officially changed that teaching in the 50s. Yeah, exactly. All right, so that's protection, right? And we have, and I think very important what Phyllis said, right, is this sort of basic sort of acknowledgement, validation of a person's existence.
Protect us from sinning.
And that could be also, right? Okay, and right, so protection, physical protection, right? But also protect us from ourselves, right? Protect us from the tendency to behave in ways that are not healthy.
Does it anthropomorphize God? I mean, like you made in the face.
Good question. We talked before about God sniffing, right? We often, when we make offerings, right, it makes a reach nichoach, right? It makes a pleasing odor that wafts up to heaven, right? We have the idea that how did God free us from the land of Egypt? The yad chazakah uvizroa nituyah. Right, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, right? Does God have an arm? Right? When the Israelites, start groaning in the land of Egypt, right? Their groan reaches what? The ear of God, right? So anthropomorphizations are all over the Bible, right? The Bible is not embarrassed or concerned about anthropomorphism. You know who really is, though? You know who doesn't like that? Maimonides really doesn't like it. He says that the Bible he was one of the first people to sort of historicize the Bible. Right? The Bible was written in the language that the people at the time could understand. Right? These are metaphors. These are ways of making sense for humans, and he would like to talk about like primitive humans, people who aren't as smart as Maimonides, because as he'd be the first one to tell you, no one is as smart as Maimonides, right? So yeah, go ahead, Phyllis.
As far as historical Judaism, so before rabbinical Judaism, did people always have the idea that God was in heaven and heaven was above?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
I think they always looked up.
I mean, I think that heaven is one of the places. I think it's an interesting question. I think that certainly throughout the Bible you will find, right, in the Psalms it says, Shemaim Ladonai, V'ha'aretz Natan Livnei Adam, right? That the heavens belong to God, right? And the earth is given to people, right? So there is that tradition a lot, right? But there's also the tradition, right, that God or gods, and there are traditions of other gods in the Bible, right? Talks about other gods all the time, right? That they sort of dwell in places,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that Judaism had to confront, right, and confronts right from the beginning, right, is the God who changes domicile.
Changes what?
Domicile,
You mean abodes?
abode. If can God really move? Right? So one of the things that the prophets affirmed, right, was that when the Israelites went into exile, God went with them, right, which is not a given in the ancient world.
One of the things I wrote years ago in my Tanakh, reading about God moving, I wrote a mobile God.
Yeah.
He's a mobile God.
There we go. All right, so let's get to grace. What does grace mean, do you think?
Blessings.
No.
No.
I don't think so, because I don't think if it were just blessings, then they would just use the word Yivarechecha. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's divine forgiveness, which is not really based on anything you've done.
Right. So that is, as I was saying before, that is I associate that with a very sort of Christian understanding of grace. There certainly is that kind of grace in Judaism, but it's not that sort of unlooked for forgiveness.
Well, it had nothing to do with the person's looking or not looking. It's just the presumed essence of the divine.
Yeah, that's interesting. See, again, the reason I associate that with so much with Christianity, right, is because the ultimate act of grace, right, is Jesus's self-sacrifice, right, the dying God, which comes from Greek, right, doesn't come from, God doesn't do that in Judaism. And forgiveness in Judaism is always predicated, at least for the rabbis in the Bible. In the Bible, I think it's predicated on offerings, right? On coming to God and repairing the breach, right? And in rabbinic Judaism, it's based on tshuva, right? That the person returns to God, right? But there's never
grace.
There's never grace in the sense of I'm an abject sinner and I'm doing nothing about it, and God is gonna Judaism is always a two-way street in the relationship between God and people, right? God and people are always in relationship with one another based on the necessity for people to be active in that relationship. We're not just passive recipients of God's grace. Yeah, go ahead.
Which brings me to a question that I come up with daily. If I bless God, the food, for bread, and waking me up, everything, I bless you. And I'm thanking Him for all His blessings that God does for me and makes me and does for me. But when I say I bless you, I think to myself, how can I possibly bless God? Everything is, how can I bless God just by saying, blessed art thou, O Lord our God? That's enough for Him. And how do you serve God? Is studying serving God? Is services serve how?
These are great questions, right? And I think the first question I would say, well, yeah, part of it, right, is that that Baruch, right, that address to God in the second person, right, is part of what establishes a relationship with God, right? And so here, right, these are sort of third person imperatives, right? This is interesting, right? Because in Judaism, generally we will say Baruch Atah, right, something like this, or we'll say Ribono Shel Olam, right, the Master of the world, right? We'll address God in the second person. This is interesting because it's addressing God in the third person, right? May God bless. The second person here is the person on whom we are sort of placing God's name.
Is that a blessing to God?
it's not a blessing to God. We're asking God for a blessing. Right?
That's what we ever do.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, in a
And how do
sense.
we serve God? I mean, by
Well, I mean,
Acting with grace.
well, okay, so I looked at, so I'll read you soon this thing from Jonathan Sachs about grace, but I think, so I don't have my own idea exactly about what grace is here. I'm sort of under his tutelage. So I'll read that to you in a second. Any other ideas?
Well, language goes back and forth between understanding what this basically, what's to be given as an understanding of the use of language, and the Hebrew and Hebraic thinking in Judaism that is developed in such a way as that we have to compare it with current thinking and current pronunciation of how it affects our secular life. So if we're thinking in terms, it's hard to bridge these thoughts that easily where you have a separation when you're talking about different things.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's, I think what this is, one thing I would say that, and again, under the influence of Rabbi Sachs, right, I would say that it's actually, I don't think it's that hard. I think obviously this is written in a different time, right? But I do think it's important to sort of recognize, right, that protection in a sense, right, is about what we need, right? Protection is what we need in the world, what we need from the world. And this is getting to your question, I think also, Faye, right? Maybe, right, and this is going to give away the game a little bit in terms of, what I learned from Rabbi Sachs, but that maybe the vihuneka, right, is about other people, right? So I need protection, right? But I also need to be part of a community, right? And how do I serve God? Right? There are many ways in Judaism to serve God, right? One of them, of course, is to serve other people, right? Right? The old idea about how do we understand God's hands, right? Well, these are God's hands, right? Your hands are God's hands. Every person, is essentially God's hands, right? That we are put on the world in the world, right, to do what God wants, basically, right? Which is, it's serve people and animals, right? Yeah. Not only animals. I mean, animals are important, Faye. Don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of animals.
Can we ask a question?
Yeah.
It seems to me that we should have examples of how it was in earlier development of the religion and understanding of the rabbis to current questions, which is what your job is.
So
my comment on that is there's nothing new under the sun. It would assume, just take that phrase, we would assume that Solomon says, I can handle all these solutions in my time, why can't you in yours? Kind of question.
I mean, I think that part of the, I think that one of the things about, our tradition, right, is there is sort of are you cold, Rich? Okay. Sort of a recognition that there is nothing new under the sun, right? People don't really change that much. We're not actually that different from the people that wrote the Bible, right? Our culture is very different, right? Our politics might be a little different, but deep down, right, we still need protection, right? What Rachel was saying, right? That we still feel very vulnerable in the world, even though our lives are probably a lot more secure than the lives of the people who wrote this down, right? And we still need to find a way to be given, I think here, given the grace, right, to figure out how are we going to serve God? How are we going to serve our community? How are we going to serve other people? How are we going to serve animals, right? What can I do, right? And then the third one here, right, at the end of this one, right, is that we want shalom, right? We want peace. So I'm going to read I'll show you a couple of passages that this person whose name escapes me at the top, Mark Novak, found a couple of these things. So this one this is from the Baal Shem Tov, right? It gets to what I think you were talking about a little bit about, Phyllis, right? that they shall place my name upon the children of Israel and shall bless them, right? That you need to bless, when you bless, you need to bless with the Yud He Vav He, right? You don't use the word, I mean, in a sense, right, it's very interesting, right? We now say, Jews tend to say Adonai, right, for the Yud He Vav He, right? So much so that Adonai now is sort of, has become Yud He Vav He,
Yes.
and people don't say Adonai anymore, they say Hashem, right? To avoid saying Adonai. So it's like an avoidance of an avoidance, right? But when you use the priestly blessing, right, you use God's name.
Yeah, I thought.
Well, you'd have, I mean, but now I think in our day, right, in our day, Yud He Vav He has become Adonai. So we say Adonai. But very important, right, that we don't say God, right? May God bless you and keep you. You have to say it in Hebrew, is basically, you know, don't use Polish, right?
Let's say you don't speak or read Hebrew.
You don't need to.
Everything can be done in English, right?
I mean,
I know when I pray a bracha, I know God said to me, English, please.
I don't think so.
Like you don't speak
but-
Hebrew.
Again, it's not, remember, I don't think this is about God. I think God understands all the various languages, right? I think the point is that there is a power to the Hebrew, right? There's a power to the original language. And this is true in whatever culture you're in, right? Shakespeare might be great in the Russian translation, right, of Boris Pasternak, but it's not Shakespeare, right? May God bless you and keep you is nice, but it's not Yevarechecha Adonai B'Yishmerecha.
But he understands me, God bless.
Right, but the point is not, but I think my point is that it's not about God, it's about us, right? And even if you don't speak a particular language, like our Muslim friends who come on a regular basis on Thanksgiving and they come and they read the Quran, right? They don't speak, they're from Pakistan, they don't speak Arabic, right? But they wouldn't read the Quran in any other language but Arabic, because it's not the same, right? It doesn't have the same power, it doesn't have the same resonance in translation that it does in
Many
English.
people feel that the Catholic Bible should be in Latin.
Right, exactly. No, I think there's a legitimate beef that a lot of Catholics have, right, with the change from Latin, just like I think there's a legitimate beef that a lot of Jews have, right? If there's no English in the service, if there's too much English in the service, if there's no Hebrew, you know, like it's always a balancing act, right? It's about the person praying. It's not about God.
So when God created the earth, he spoke and he said, let there be light, blah, blah, blah.
He didn't say let there be light. He said Yehior.
He spoke, he created in Hebrew.
Right, and this is why we have Loshen HaKodesh, right? The idea of the holy language, right? Because what was the Jews like to say? What language did God create the world in? Duh, right? Hebrew, of course. That's God's native language. Now, of course, right? We know that's, you know, we can even doubt, right, whether or not God created the world with language, right? We can be skeptical about that, right? Whereas at the same time, we can affirm that the language of creation is Hebrew, right? And we can understand that there may be other cultures who don't have that understanding, and all of those things can exist simultaneously, right? We don't have to have exclusive. There needs to be no hegemony about this.
All
right.
You think the other peoples of the world have the capacity to understand, period, the Hebrew in their own translation, in their own way? You think the current other major religions get it?
Get what?
Well, get the derivation of Hebrew and Judaism to their own religion.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that is always going to be a point of tension, between you know, Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Judaism and Christianity, that we come from the same stock, right? And there's always going to be that sort of sibling love and rivalry. And it's, and I think it's a, I think that's one of the reasons why there's such an emphasis in those two religions on supersessionism, right? It's not enough that we came out of the same scriptures that Judaism came from, right? We need to claim that we're better, right? That we have made that old way obsolete, right? Why do we have the Old Testament and the New Testament? Who wants an Old Testament? It's all dusty and yucky and gross. I want the new one.
Well, don't they say that the Old Testament, that God is very vengeful? And
God is a lot of things.
in the New Testament,
God is
it's all about forgiveness.
That is a very, very nice,
That's what
very
I've
simple,
heard.
very simplified understanding of what this is. Yeah.
No, that's
But
what
anyway,
I've heard.
Yeah, it's much more complicated than that. Wait, Maureen, listen to Shirley.
I look at it this way. God created all of this. But the first people who spoke about monotheism and who spoke about this spoke Hebrew.
Yeah,
That's why we don't know if God said a word. We have no way of knowing that.
They may have spoken Egyptian, but that's another.
right. The stories got written down.
Aramaic was
Right,
around.
the stories got written down in Hebrew. Right, the stories got written down in Hebrew. And so
The beginning of monotheism and the idea of God was first spoken in.
There's a debate about that.
Right,
There's a debate about.
there's always going to be scholarly debates, right? There's always going to be scholarly debates about that. But I think I think what Shirley is saying is outside of the academy, right, is a fairly helpful way of understanding it, right? Which is that the Jews, in a sense, were the people who brought this stuff to the world.
Yeah.
And right.
But I have another question.
Okay.
Okay. It's true, you can have creation without language, but how can you recognize and understand it without language?
And I think that's one of the brilliant parts, right? One of the brilliant aspects of our scripture, right? Is this connection between language and creation, right? Because humans create so much through language, right? And so we have in the first chapter of Genesis, right, is the actual, and God said, let there be, and there was, right? In the second chapter, right, we have the story of the first Adam, right, who's given the task of what? Naming everything, right? Does anything really exist before it's named, right? I mean, it's like so you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, I don't think of it that way.
Yeah.
But that's what I
Right.
hear.
Again, sort of.
Christianity
Right.
is,
Right.
God has become forgiving. He does sacrifice his son though, which is.
A little bit, just a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. And that supposedly newly forgiving God, right, is invoked to do all kinds of terribly violent and unforgivable things to all kinds of people across the world. So I'm not convinced. And anyway, if you read the Tanakh, right, you'll see that God is all kinds of things, right? God is incredibly merciful and God is incredibly vengeful, right? Yeah.
What's older, Hebrew or Sanskrit?
Sorry?
What's older, Hebrew or Sanskrit?
They're two different.
They're from two different parts of the
One
world.
is
I'm not.
Indo-European and the other is Semitic.
What's
Yeah.
older? Is
I
it
don't know.
Hinduism
Do you know?
before Judaism?
No, but it doesn't matter.
I'm not sure it's entirely, but I think it's an interesting question. I have a feeling that Sanskrit is older, but I may be wrong. Yeah. Go ahead, Maureen.
Just to kind of put in perspective where my mind came from, I'm in my 80s, as many of you may have advanced age, I don't know. But in the 50s, when I was at Boston University in my undergraduate degree, they had a teacher, on staff, and it was required to take theology. So it came out a lovely teacher, but somebody out of a different tradition than mine, obviously, because he's talking about in the religion that they had as a required course. He referred to the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I got up, probably to the embarrassment of myself and many other people who are Jewish there. I said, there's no such thing as an Old Testament to me. It's living, it's, and went forth on that. But that issue of separation of thinking and what's in one statement of Paul and the rest of the guys who wrote that New Testament is entirely different than what he may have and what he might have known in his changes to what I know. So my experience was just as well to say, okay, I'm not Paul, but I could certainly talk about the so-called Old Testament. There's no such thing as a living testament, it's a Torah.
Yeah.
And that, that was sort of kind of eye-opening for any Christians who were in the room.
Yeah.
They were never at that point had any idea that they needed to know that,
Right.
what to be involved with that.
Right.
So this whole discussion of what is from one source and what is from another source and how it came about and what it means in different cultures has got a very local foundation in every college and every discussion and every place that people learns about.
Yeah. Absolutely, Maury, and it's also important to remember, right, that just as for us Jews, right, the Tanakh is just the Bible, right? There's no old and no new, right? It's the Bible, right? But it's important to remember two things. First of all, that we are not biblical Jews, right? We look to the Torah, right, and to the rest of the Tanakh as a source, but it's just one source. It's not the only source that we use, right? And there are many things that are laid down as immutable law in Torah that is completely at odds with what we do today. And a good example of that is capital punishment, right? There was no incarceration mentioned in the Torah, right? You either paid a fine or you were stoned or burned or some other sort of terrible capital punishment. The rabbis came along, right, and said, nope, no capital punishment. Right? It's not part of rabbinic law, right? They now, of course, they can't say we're taking it out of the Torah, right? What do they have to do? They have to make the process of getting to a capital sentence so complicated, so impossible, right, that it'll just never happen, right? And so we changed it too, right? The Jews, right? The only person that's ever been executed in judicially, I must say, in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, is Eichmann, right?
Who?
Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann. He was the only person that was ever executed out of. We can talk about extrajudicial killings. That's another story, right? But we're not going to talk about that.
That's another thing we need protection from being falsely accused.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to cut this short. And the other thing I was going to say, right, is that I would never want to deny other people's experience of Scripture, right? So that for Christians, it's very meaningful, right, to have an Old Testament and a New Testament. And if they want to understand it the way Rachel wants to understand it, I mean, not that you understand it, but the way that you've been told about it, right? I mean, that is their right. I disagree with them, and if they ask, I'll tell them, right? But like people grew up with the Bible they grew up with, and very often it's in English and not in Hebrew. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, as I understand it, the Christians think that the Old Testament prefigures the New.
100%. So it's actually, in that sense, it's not a dead letter.
Yeah.
Right? In actual fact, right? There's one way of understanding the New Testament is as a midrash, right? An interpretation of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So it's not dead at all. Right?
Well, they changed all the definitions.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's what Midrash does. We'll bring Midrash in, and then you can see, like, the rabbis will say, don't read this word that's clearly this word. Read that word, which is a different word entirely. So,
They left out all the mitzvot.
yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. All right, so I'm going to read this. We're long over time. I apologize, but I did want to read these little sections from Jonathan Sachs and then from Nehemiah Poland. So, protection, grace, and peace. Right? These are God's blessings communicated by the priests. Right? This is what we are, what we pray for, he says. Right? If you seek to understand a people, look at its prayers. The Jewish people did not ask for wealth or power. They did not hunger after empire. They had no desire to conquer or to convert the world, right? We discussed this a little bit. They asked for protection, which he describes as the right to live true to themselves without fear, right? For grace, the ability to be an agent for good in others, right? And which is a little different than the way I described it before, right? He talks about it, like I'm going to bring, by being great, by being imbued with grace, right? I will help you be the best person you can be, right? And for peace. And remember, peace is not just peace in Hebrew, as we think of it, right? Shalom is related to shleimut, right? To wholeness, to completeness. So it says the fullness of being in which each of us brings our individual gifts to the common good. That is all our ancestors prayed for, and it is still all we need. Right? And here's Nehemiah Poland, who's one of my teachers at Hebrew College. The Sfat Emet, that's a Hasidic teacher, has a mystical view of the priestly blessing. He does not emphasize the uniqueness of the lineage of the Aaronite priesthood. Right? Very important in Judaism, right? That when the temple was destroyed, in a sense, we all became priests, and each person's home became a little temple. Right? And all the things that we do in our homes is sort of a replacement for what the priests used to do in the temple, which is one of the reasons I think the parents always say the priestly blessing to the kids on Shabbos, right? Because that's what the priests would do in the temple. All right? We are all priests working to cultivate the sublime spirit, the inner point, hanikudah hapnimit, right? That's a Hasidic understanding of God. God is not, right, necessarily always in heaven, right? God is also like our truest innermost point, right? Our innermost soul, right? That's what God is. And when we really are praying, that's where we're looking. We're not looking to heaven, we're looking deeply inside. Reaching for the nikudah pnimit is what today is often called a spiritual practice. Whoa! Shalom is the inner vitality that provides fulfillment in life. So Sfat Emet links inwardness to shalom that makes the priestly blessing a call to all-inclusiveness, an invitation to appreciate the soaring range and interconnectedness of all being. So it's very fancy, right? But I think is kind of powerful, right? That when we say the priestly blessing, we're sort of looking at the interconnectedness of the entire world. Yeah, go ahead, Faye, you get the last word.
In Judaism, when we make it home, our table's supposed to be the altar. The table being the altar, does that mean to worship and be holy without diet?
Absolutely.
That's the table.
It's one of the things. It's why we have the sort of all the Shabbat rituals, all the blessings after all the blessings we say after we eat, right? So yeah, it's all